Thanks, Andy. And if I could ask the panelists to come up, we've got Eric Schmidt from Alphabet and Reid Hoffman from Greylock and co-founder of LinkedIn. And Jeff, please come on up. And let me, while people are getting up, and I don't know if you have mics or we can get some up here. Andy, let me just pick up. You agreed with a lot of what Jeff was saying, but you didn't seem to be very enthusiastic about the basic income in particular. Jeff wrapped up talking about the need for not just redistribution, but I think massive redistribution. So why don't you guys mix it up a little bit? Tell me a little bit about why you aren't such a fan of basic income, and it sounds like redistribution, if I'm understanding that right.
Well, I agree with Jeff. Redistribution is going to be increasingly important because the companies that these guys create, among lots of... I'm sorry. Is this working? The companies that you two create have a tendency toward winner-take-all dynamics. So concentration of wealth and income is a thing that is going on. I think it's going to continue. I'll just restate myself. It does not solve the problems. Giving money to people with no strings attached gives them money. People need more money. They need other things as well. I do not think the universal basic income provides them. And my thought experiment about what would happen in these communities if people had a few extra $100 a month, those lines would not change very much, in my view.
Jeff?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's important to think about universal basic income in two ways and to differentiate. One is as a metaphor, and the second is as a literal policy. As a metaphor, the idea that everybody should be supported to have basic needs met, whether it's health, community, childcare, and so forth, I think is a overwhelmingly right and proven principle. And one thing I would say from the data is that if you look at almost any league ranking of countries in terms of subjective well-being or performance on various social dimensions, it's inevitable that the countries at the top of the list are Norway, Denmark, Sweden. So the social democratic Scandinavian countries. They top the World Happiness Report year after year. They top almost every metric of performance. What do? They don't have universal basic income per se as a literal policy, but they have a social welfare society that guarantees universal access to quality services. They also have a lot of leisure time, by the way. Try calling your favorite Swedish colleague from late July to early September. They're in the archipelago. They're on their boat. They're having an absolutely wonderful time, and they don't want to hear from you. And they will not pick up their phone. And this is true of Northern Europe in general. It's really civilized life, by the way. It's several hundred hours per year less work on average than in the United States. Unemployment rates are low, but vacation time is high. Paternity and maternity leave are very generous. Guaranteed time. To my mind, this is decency. And the difference is that they're not after creating as many billionaires as they can, and they're not after raw maximization of shareholder value, and they're after competitive companies, by the way, and they've got a lot of them in this industry, but they're really after a kind of civilized, balanced life. UBI, as a very specific proposal, I find a little bit mischaracterized, because when you think about the range of social approaches to a healthy life, it's not just transferring income, it's having a decent healthcare system, it's having decent schools, it's having decent infrastructure, it's having a green environment, it's many things. So I'm not for UBI as literal policy. I am absolutely for it as metaphor of good society. And there's a lot of direct income transfer in that policy, but it's targeted for working mothers, for childcare, for early childhood development, for maternity leave, for vacation time. That seems to me to get to a lot of these work issues that would go with the straight income transfer that would be problematic.
Well, let me just pick
Sure.
up. So one thing that wasn't on that list was work or a job.
Yeah.
And so in Fishtown, part of what some sociologists are saying, the problem has been that the jobs have disappeared even if we supplement the income. I take it you disagree with that view?
Eric, bring our other two panelists in. Jeff and I have talked.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, go ahead, just answer that
Just
question.
one, yeah, I should be clear about this. I think work is important, but I don't think, as I've said many times now, that the scorecard of how many jobs are created or not is so important. People do want jobs. It's a lot about meaning. It's a lot about their human creation. It's a lot about purpose. But it can be shorter hours. It can be subsidized. It can be many, many things. And it is not just a raw count. The problem in Fishtown is those people have been left to die. That's how our country works. That's not a measure of anything except the indecency of American society.
All right.
At the top.
You could do a thought experiment where imagine that the United States were run with a goal of having everybody who is capable of working have at least a part-time job. And you could imagine adjusting our policies, our laws, and so forth, that's always the case. So if you had that as a rule, which we do not have in our country, I think you would end up saving money. And the reason is, and again, I'm accounting for moms and daycare and elderly and people who are ill and so forth and so on, trying to be reasonable about that. But if you did, the number of sort of negative externalities, the drug use and the bad family situations would be materially improved, probably enough to pay for the subsidy that you need to do it. And the easiest way to see this is look at in the rural areas which they've lost manufacturing jobs. They had grown up with a supportive infrastructure around the manufacturing jobs, which are no longer there. They're not going to get out of it, right? And they're also not going to move because they can't afford to move to the cities, which are more expensive. Furthermore, people are moving from rural to city area. So if you care about it as a political issue, which Jeffrey obviously does, the overweighting of rural counties results in the outcomes in the election. It solves that problem, right? Because all of a sudden people have a reason to doing what they're doing. So to me, this is a policy issue. And the reason to worry about this in our entire day's conversation is all the evidence is that inequality is going to increase on a relative basis.
Well, the technology is driving that way, but as Jeff and others have made the argument, there's policy factors as well.
Well, but again, we understand redistribution, but the fact of the matter is that America is particularly good at building global businesses that have a relatively small number of employees who are serving a much larger set of customers, right? It's the American, and many other countries are learning how to do this as well. We're going to have to figure out a way to do this. We have plenty of tools, redistribution. I would suggest that the country's goal should be full employment all the time and do whatever it takes, which includes things like the Works Projects Administration and a depression and all that kind of stuff. And that's antithetical to the classic economic view, but I would argue that the health of the society is strongest when every conceivable person has some kind of a job which makes some kind of sense, gives them a stake in the outcome.
Reid, you're in the business of building and funding a lot of winner-take-all companies. Josh brought up the example of highly scalable businesses. I imagine those are really good as an investor. Does that work with Erik's vision? Are those compatible, or are we going to be able to do both those things at the same time?
I think the answer is yes, because part of what Erik's vision is saying is that what you're actually doing is maximizing, trying to get to, like, as part of the algorithm that we compute is not just returns to capital, but also to say the way that we configure it is actually, in fact, to get a certain amount of places where people can earn their, they can work and earn their place in the community. Because part of the question is people are somewhat relative, which is one problem. And if you get to the vice and board,
that they care about their relative ranking, not their absolute.
Exactly, right? So there's that problem you need to do. So they need to feel that they've kind of gotten their place and they've outcompeted some people and so forth. And so if you lead with a large disenfranchised group, they either kill themselves or they kill you. And so, you know, take one or the other. So I think that does work, but you do have to focus on what are you doing with the massive workforce as well.
Let's get some questions. I'm sure a lot of people here have some questions, so we can go. How about Jan? Can we?
You have one?
Jan LeCun. So the first industrial revolution was instrumental in sort of creating Marxism and making it popular? Is the new machine age going to create Marxism v2.0?
Marxism?
I have no reason to be confident that equally dumb, bad ideologies won't come out of this. I hope they're not as impactful.
How about right up here, Martin?
What we've been told is we need full employment. Erik and Jeff have both said that. But can't we provide this with redistribution or with a high income tax in the caring professions? Because if you're rich, then you would prefer to have a real carer, real people to support you when you're old. And if we could provide dignified, well-paid jobs for everyone, that would help, and also for carers for children as well. So surely there are lots of jobs that aren't going to be replaced very quickly by machines, which don't require you to know about coding, and surely with suitable redistribution or public sector, there could be a large number of dignified and satisfying jobs provided for caring professions, gardeners in public parks, and other jobs that can't be readily mechanized.
Who'd like to take that?
Well, I think that there's going to be certainly a large increase in what you would think of as the person-on-person jobs. Caring is one of them, education is another, entertainment's another, cultural creation's another, and I think there's a broad swath of that. And I actually think that's one of the things that's like, okay, how do we make sure that those are places where people feel like they can actually make a living, feel like they've earned a place and so forth, and that the culture part of it still works.
Part of this depends on the pace of technological progress. And Erik, we were talking earlier, you're confident that AI will progress quite rapidly?
So as a result of today and looking at all this, I've become convinced that actually this is going to happen much, much quicker than even we think of, for a very simple reason that we have not talked about. All those sort of leading economies at the moment are facing huge demographic challenges. So Korea, Japan, Germany, China because of the stupid one-child policy, even the United States, right? Today there's roughly 15% of the people are over 65. The number I read indicated that in 2060 would be 24%, but the trends are clear, so even in America. So economists understand this notion of a dependency ratio, right? The people who work and the people they support. So Martin asked a very reasonable question. And my subsequent question is, the old person needs the income to support the person who's helping them. How does that occur? So you have a declining percentage of people, and again, Andy, you can keep me checked here as a proper economist. The declining percentage of people who are doing work, their productivity has to increase. How are they going to increase the productivity of the workforce? Through automation, through humans working with computers. Now, it's very, very interesting to discuss the end of work and all those things and so forth, and I'm happy to talk about that in this conference in Asilomar in a decade. But right now, I think there's going to be a lot more work, and the work will be humans and computers together. And if you go back, and Erik, you made this interesting conversation in our lunch, where you said that if what we invent as a society is smart computers and robots and AI that are different from humans, that augment what humans do, then they won't substitute for human jobs. So I think the call to arms is quite clear. We have to organize in the countries that I'm describing to accelerate this. The countries need it, and therefore they're going to do it with us or without us. These are the countries that are the leaders in robotics at the mechanical and intellectual level today, right? And it's going to happen, right? So we might as well just assume it's going to happen and make it work well. And I brought my quote to illustrate this. Everyone had quotes. This is my favorite quote. We believe that if men have the talent to invent new machines that put men out of work, they have the talent to put those men back to work. President John F. Kennedy, September 1962, 55 years ago. If you guys are so smart to put everybody out to work, why don't you invent a new product, which is what to do with all the people who are displaced and make them more capable in the workforce. I defy you to argue that you cannot take somebody who has lost some job and does not have the right skills, where you can't build a product that can make them smarter and more capable, if they wish to participate in the emerging workforce.
Let me just add one thing to that, because look, there's a lot of challenges, and getting through this period, I think, is not, to just be optimistic and say it's going to work itself out. I think you need to be mindful, I think was the earlier thing about in terms of being an optimist. But for example, Airbnb in November launched a product that was essentially magical trips, which is you can turn any location into a destination because people can say, oh, I'm going to teach you beer making. I'm going to take you on a tour of local graffiti art. I'm going to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a kind of product that people can then be kind of entrepreneurs of. Here, you can turn Detroit into a tourist destination, right? So, it's only one thing, but it's illustrative.
I couldn't agree more with that. And that literally is happening. Keep in mind, though, think how the established travel guide industry is going to respond to that. And our colleague at Harvard, Larry Lessig, has a wonderful way to think about the policy and the legal choices that we face. He says, look, it's simple. We can protect the future from the past, or we can protect the past from the future. I think all of us here think that we have the opportunity to create a much, much better future. Part of our job is to work against the forces of the status quo and incumbency and the people who love nostalgia and the past and allow exactly things like that Airbnb model to happen.
So we have some other hands. Let's get, how about someone towards the back there? Max, you go ahead and pick one of the people further back.
You're on. Everybody say their name first. Thanks, Max. Andrew Maynard. This conversation is really focusing on policy, and I think, Erik, you were the person that said that this is really a policy challenge, not necessarily an AI challenge. Does that mean that we need to increase policy literacy within the AI community?
Maybe give it to Erik. You bridge these communities as much as anyone.
Well, everyone would like their government to be more intelligent and do what they want. It's sort of an unfulfilled ambition in every country. In every country I visited, the citizens are unhappy with their government. So with that as a preamble, I think there's a very large amount of education. But I think the gap is so large now that the gap between the governments in terms of their understanding of software, let alone AI, is so large that it's almost hopeless. So yeah, so what we have to do is we basically have to have a whole generation of people, and by the way, they're much younger, right? And they need to get in power, and they need to understand these things. And so whether it's the ethics arguments, which I think are profound and are well worth debating, and we need a whole initiative around that. But at the end of the day, think about how much more efficient, and I mean, I'm not talking about lower costs, I'm just being efficient in delivery of services, the government of your country would be if it were far more automated. Right? It would be more accurate, it would collect taxes better, it would police people better, all those kinds of things that governments do. And yet very few countries have been able to do it effectively. That's
important. I think from the press reports, when you wrote up that gold elevator, that was one of the things that they said that you talked to the president-elect about. But the question, I think, was also about the other side of that, was whether this community needs to become more policy literate. Is it something that, in addition to learning back propagation or whatever the more current technique is. You clearly need to know everything, but my suggestion would be that you train people whose full-time jobs is that stuff so that you guys can invent AI and AGI in particular.
Reid, does that sound right?
Yeah, I think, look, you really want to actually accelerate towards creating the future and making sure the future is inclusive, but not by trying to enshrine the past. And I think that the way to do that is you have the technological skills, you keep doing that, but you train the people to interface with all these folks. You don't do it yourself.
Great. Let's get some more questions. How about over here?
Okay. Who are you pointing to?
Go ahead and
we'll do both of them.
So I had I have a comment on Jeff's discussion on nastiness. So we have a lot of people in the world, so even if a small number are nasty, that's going to be a lot of nastiness. I think you implied that it's getting worse. I have an observation, would be interested in your response. I think our information about nastiness is getting exponentially better. So there's some nastiness 10,000 miles away. We not only hear about it, we experience it. There could be a battle that wiped out the next village 100 years ago and we wouldn't even hear about it. All the measures of the opposite of nastiness are getting dramatically better. Steven Pinker documents an exponential decline in violence. There was one democracy in the world 2 centuries ago, 5 2 centuries ago. We can argue how many there are today, but it's a lot more than 5. Poverty has been cut, according to the World Bank, 50% worldwide in the last 20 years, education is up, etc. So is it your view that nastiness is getting worse? My view is that, for example, social media is actually spreading a universal set of ethical beliefs. We hear very dramatically when there's exceptions to that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I didn't say it's getting worse. I just said it's a nasty world, and it is very much a nasty world. And here comes a very powerful technology, extraordinary in what it can do. The lesson of technology in every technology is that it can be deployed for the good or be deployed for the bad. And this one is one of the most powerful imaginable. And it can be deployed for cyber war, it can be deployed for creating mass surveillance of society, it can be deployed for allowing for an improvement of quality of life. And all I was advising was don't only make a list of the desirables, understand how tough this world is and how these technologies can be very, very badly deployed, and I think many of them are already being very badly deployed. Privacy has plummeted in our society. Government surveillance has soared. Cyber warfare is obviously a very real, is a reality, and it has already invaded the US in a presidential election, and we're so blasé about this we can barely even focus on a coherent discussion other than Donald Trump's tweets. So to my view, this is, my point was only not trends. By the way, it's just going to take one war to change Steven Pinker's trends, so I'm not too persuaded by that. In 1913, all of this techno-optimism was real, and a war came that 102 years later, historians cannot explain because it is completely just, I mean, you can explain a TikTok chronology of World War I, but you can't explain a deeper cause of World War I. It's just mindless. And so we're not out of that. That's human nature. Here you have this very powerful technology, and I am only advising that it's not just a list of goods and bads, but a real activacy by this community about dangers already being made by very powerful players within the community, by the way. So this is not a sweet community. This is already being deployed for mass greed, mass wealth, mass invasion of privacy, mass surveillance, many things. And all I'm saying is let's be real about that, that it's not better or worse, it's just human.
Erik?
I asked David Artur, who is your colleague, on this question of the wealth created by AI, and he used the analogy of oil. And oil was discovered clearly very wealthy, right? Norway gets oil, does all the right things. The Arab world also has the oil, ends up in great conflict. So if you follow the line of reasoning, the likelihood is the same outcome for everything we're doing. There's one interesting twist on it, however, that the work that we're doing is also available for people who don't have oil in the ground. And so a lot will depend on whether the governments and the smart people in those governments can figure out a way to use the technology to address the ever-present social problems and motivational problems, and economic problems that they face. But it is going to be available to them in a way that the oil boom was not available to those that didn't have oil.
Yes. Well, and that underscores the point of this policy issue that the same resource can lead to two very different outcomes. Let's get a couple other questions, and I think I promised over here.
Yep, Neil Lawrence. So I was struck that people have mentioned a few things like it's nice to sit in coffee shops and talk with your friends, but we all have to have a sense of purpose in our lives, and often that sense of purpose is driven by a common purpose from our community. And so if you go into these farming communities, you go into the coal mining communities, that sense of purpose is missing because that work has gone, and hard work comes with a sense of purpose. So some of the things you were asking for, Jeff, are correlated with the fact that you're doing something hard that no one else is doing, and then you feel that you're doing something special, and that gives you this common sense of purpose. But I've heard very little so far about when these new waves of jobs, like does data mining replace coal mining with that same sense of purpose? And my argument would be no, it doesn't. And in coal mining communities near Sheffield, where I work, and when I go in there, I see nothing to replace that in the type of jobs that are there. So how can we replace that sense of community that came with these very hard works that's there for academics, for us?
Yeah, can I just disagree? The data miners I know are very happy and very full of purpose. So I think it's, if you make the assumption that coal miners can become data miners, I'm sure they're quite fulfilled.
And Reid, I think you were just at a happiness conference, right? Yeah. No, okay.
I do a conference with some friends on how do you lead a meaningful life, which includes a session on happiness. But look, I think the other thing about this is communities change a lot in part because of urbanization. And so there's a lot of nostalgia for communities because urbanization actually leads to very different social patterns. And part of what you see is a shift in urbanization, which I think is an ongoing shift. And so I think cultural rebuild, because actually, in fact, we have a rising heroin problem in all the rural areas of the U.S., et cetera. There's a bunch of really important things to work on here, but I don't think it's you have to figure out how to do the cultural rebuild and the narrative that isn't like, oh, it's just because it's a hard job.
I think your point is a superb one. And I don't think it can be recreated or should be recreated by keeping coal mining intact. But where it seems to work is where there's a sense of community in a deeper way, and that's preserved. And one of the sociological realities of the United States specifically is that we have a very, very weak sense of community compared to almost any of the Western European countries, for example. And we have also an Anglo-Saxon tradition, which I find completely bizarre, that was captured by Margaret Thatcher's saying there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. And that's a very deep belief. There's a long story to it, a long history to it. I find it anthropologically preposterous, but it leads to the kind of libertarian view of the United States, which is a predominant power view, which is just leave me alone. And that's where these communities can't rebound, because the underlying community is degraded in the sense of even having community. So there really is a values issue here that's quite deep. It's not going to be solved within the AI community, and it's not even a trick of jobs. It's a deeper question of the purpose of society. And when we have been for almost 50 years now in this country saying cut taxes, we don't have to help the freeloaders, we don't have to do this, we don't have to do that, it's really degraded our sense of common purpose in the United States.
One of the graphs I really should have shown is some amazing research done by Bob Putnam, who's a quantitative sociologist, and he's managed to find these different measures of reality and sense of community in America over more than 100 years, and they all show the same pattern. And these are as disparate as marriage across classes, progressivity of the income tax, Eric, what were a couple of other ones? But incredibly different measures. They all follow the same pattern. Measures of community were going down until after World War I. They started to go upward right around World War II. They kept on going up. We were really having a community orientation right around until the late 70s or the early 80s, and then they've all been falling in lockstep ever since then.
And by the way, China has as well. Is that right? Yeah, the last 30 years. China's measures of that metrics have all fallen very dramatically. Similar reasons.
Bob's book will be out on that soon, I think. We've got a number of other hands. Let's have some really quick questions and quick answers, because we are actually running a bit late. So how about in the back, pick a couple of people, Max. Quick questions and quick answers.
Okay, I'm Stuart Russell. I'll refrain from the temptation to respond to Jeffrey's remarks, but I'll talk to you later about that.
Absolutely.
What I wanted to say was that it's pretty clear there's going to be a very disruptive transition that's going to occur, whether it's in 10 or 20 or 30 years, it doesn't matter. And people talk about, okay, we need a transition plan. But I don't hear very much about transition to what. what is the destination? What is the ideal that we could try to build a transition plan to reach? And until we have that, and I don't think it's going to be, well, we'll push up this tax, we'll reduce that tax, we'll have a bit more education. I don't think we can make these parametric changes and expect to reach a future that's going to function. And everything I'm hearing is that if we don't do anything, the future is going to be bleaker and bleaker and bleaker until things blow up.
Yeah, I think we all.
Yep.
Andy, why don't you start with that?
I disagree with that a little bit. I think we do have a rich mix of policy things that we can and should be doing that we are not. And I think it is way too soon to start to plan for a post-work world, for a post-capitalism world, for a post-price world. I hear some of those ideas sometimes. They are incredibly premature. As we showed, we are not anywhere near peak jobs or peak work yet.
But let's humor. What would be your vision? Suppose that we did, what would be the ultimate goal state that you think we could aim towards?
It would be something close to what Jeff described, this happy world of great material affluence, where a lot of us have meaning from something that doesn't look like industrial era labor. My head hurts trying to imagine what that would actually look like. I'm not a good enough science fiction writer.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine why you would go and spend 22 years getting a PhD if just to sit in a coffee shop and chat to people. It doesn't seem like that's going to work out.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I do my best work in coffee shops. I write books there, I think, and I read Aristotle, as I said. I think what is possible, look, I want to start again where I started my remarks. This is a very positive development. This is an incredibly empowering technology. The chances of wonderful outcomes are very real. It's identifying the risks, which are high inequalities and big social change to less time at work in the formal sense, because the basic needs will not be met by the human physical activity, but by the machines. Right. That's okay. So that's not a negative view. And I wouldn't be bleak about it, but I would do just what you said. I don't think, by the way, this is decades off. This has been underway for decades. So we need to think concretely about that. My view is more equality, more delivery of social services, less time at work, more time in other creative activities that humanity is actually very good at creating, and that's what's within reach.
Let's get one more question in, and then we're going to wrap up.
Just very briefly, Tommaso Poggio. I think we discussed today a lot of important questions, but many of them are kind of medium term or long term. I think the one that came up today is very urgent, is something we should deal with today. You said it well, if the people will raise before the machines. So what can we do now? Speaking to Silicon Valley, for instance, Erik, just to put on the table a very naive and very silly proposal, but to start a conversation, what about a technology tax that essentially redistribute the society with the machines is remaining as wealthy as before or more? More. People don't, so it's just a social engineering question, of course that's politics, so that's difficult, but it's certainly solvable to redistribute this missing income. Of course, you want to do it in a way so that people are satisfied, are happy, maybe not just a question of money.
So just to be clear, this is a technology tax or this is an income tax? Why are you calling it
well,
technology?
It's up. I'm not an economist. You decide.
Okay.
But
all right. Let's let the panelists
basically,
decide.
jobs go away, machines do that job, they do it better.
Yes.
Okay. The society is as rich as before or richer. So it's just a question to redistribute the wealth to the people.
Great closing question. What do you think of either Tommy's suggestion, or do you have a better one to something we can do in the short term, not in the long term? Well, go ahead, Erik.
It's very important to understand that as a result of the current elections, the likely future government is not going in the direction you're proposing, since they campaigned on massive tax cuts for wealthy people. So we have a 4-year problem. So that's short term for me. But if it had gone about different, and if we're in the short term, I'm in favor of higher taxes for rich people and redistributing them in such a way that you solve the joblessness problem. That's the redistribution. In our political system, it's almost impossible. And as my sort of final comment with Stuart, who I respect a lot, I disagree a little bit with the tone of your question, because it implies, the way you asked it, that there was going to be a major crisis in the next 15 years. I don't agree. I think that we're in the process of inventing the equivalent of oil. I think it is a huge improvement for humanity as a whole. There are a whole bunch of policy questions which are resolvable because they're within the realm of physics and understandable and so forth, and we've talked about some of them. And the earlier we can get this sort of narrative into the culture, the more likely we are to address it, because I think if we don't, the problems will get worse. So my specific answer to your question of what would I do for 15 years, which is not the same thing as the 4 years, because we're stuck with that, sorry, I didn't vote for the guy, is a rule that you maintain full employment while you fully implement AI, right? And you have to find a way to do that. And there are a number of suggestions of how to do it, so let's figure it out. I think if we did both of those, we'll be just fine.
Reid.
I agree with what Erik just said. The thing I would emphasize, because people frequently go back to New Deals and other kinds of things, is for a networked world, you want a network solution. It's one of the reasons why I frequently talk about how do you encourage entrepreneurship, or it's one of the reasons I use the Airbnb example, those sorts of things, because while it is a good patch to do, like, for example, a massive infrastructure project and so forth, and is perfectly good to do, it isn't actually sustainable. I think network solutions are much more sustainable.
Jeff?
First, I agree with what Erik said, except for the idea that we just let this new administration and Congress do what it will do, because this is the wrong direction. It's absolutely the wrong direction. In social life, you don't just go in the wrong direction expecting that somehow you retrieve the lost ground in the future. Society is too fragile and breakable for that. So I think we have to fight this trend as incredible in the face of the evidence that we've been looking at all day and say that this is absolutely wrong. You can look, by the way, at a very nice, simple statistic of the Gini coefficient, which is the simplest measure of income inequality, pre-tax and transfer and post-tax and transfer across all of the high-income OECD countries. You can find it online. The US redistributes very, very little. The social democracies redistribute a lot more. It's almost full stop. And that's a basic point that our country finds very hard to discuss. Erik's exactly right that the tendency is to go in the other direction, but this doesn't have to be the reality. Final point on Aristotle and what he teaches on apps. Aristotle was promoting the polis, participation in your city-state. And one thing that AI could do much better is to promote political participation through online secure voting and through political parties that actually didn't operate only to collect your money and beg for your vote, but operated as online communities year-round for communities of purpose and communities of politics. So if someone could invent a good e-party app so that we could actually organize and use the e-party for real day-to-day participation, I would be grateful, because I want to start a political party I don't know if it will be called the Aristotelian Party or what, but we don't, I looked into this. We don't have this yet. We don't have the right technology for online secure voting, for ID, for membership, and for participation. So this is, I think, a great job for an application for this community.
Thanks. Andy,
Tommy,
wrap it up.
I want to try to answer your question as directly as I can. The mantra that I walk around with is tax the stuff you want to see less of or that you're indifferent to, and subsidize the stuff you want to see more of. By that mantra, I don't like your technology tax. I want to see more technology tax. We have plenty of stuff that we want to see less of. Congestion, pollution, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, the stuff you're indifferent to, great big fancy cars, and tax the hell out of that. We have a rich tax basket to draw from, I'd reach for a lot of things before I reach for technology. The last thing I want to say, I feel like there's pretty good consensus here about the way we would like to be going, and a lot of disappointment about the results of the recent election. I just want to say that the two businessmen here on stage with me stuck their necks out in their community and were at the forefront of trying to push the country in the right direction during this election cycle. I want to say thank you to you two.